Okay, let's make a start. Welcome, everybody. I'm Bobby Duffy. I'm Director of the Policy Institute at King's College London, and it's my real pleasure to be chairing this event today that we're running in partnership with the Fairness Foundation as part of our ongoing Fair Society series. The aim of the series is to explore issues of fairness, inequality, meritocracy, and it has featured some of the world's leading thinkers on those sorts of issues. We've had a really incredible lineup of people. Now we share the chairing between myself and Will Snell, who's chief exec of the Fairness Foundation. But when this one came up on the spirit level, why equality is better for everyone, I grabbed at it because the book had a huge impact on me when it first came out in 2009. In fact, it was the first book I ever wrote a review for. And Kate and Richard will never have seen this because it was in a very obscure technical journal that really didn't build their case or make their case for the great sales and impact that they had. But it was a positive review, I have to say, like so many were at the time. So we're delighted to have the authors of the book, Professor Richard Wilkinson and Professor Kate Pickett, here to give their reflections on the book's themes and then how they hold up today, particularly bringing up to date with today. So after about 15 minutes from Kate and Richard, we then have responses from a truly brilliant panel who will just talk for 5 or 6 minutes each so that we can get to the discussion and questions from you in the audience. And we'll finish by 2 p.m. Firmly. So first we'll hear from David Aaronovitch, the journalist, presenter and author. Then Professor Lucinda Platt, who's Professor of Social Policy and Sociology at LSE, and then Paul Drechsler, who is former President of the CBI and Chair of the International Chamber of Commerce and Business London. So before I hand over to Kate and Richard, please do submit any questions that you have in the Q&A function that we have here, and the earlier on that you get your questions in, the more chance they are of being asked, and they can be upvoted, etc. So that does help me pick them out. So get in early with your questions. So no further ado, straight over to Kate and Richard.
Thank you very much, Bobby. Pleasure to be here today. Richard and I have been working together on inequality issues for 20 years. But I do want to pay tribute to the fact that he's been working on it for much longer than that, and for a long time, very much on his own with great tenacity and integrity. And you said you've had some great thinkers on this symposium series. Well, I have the pleasure of living with one of them. So as well as working together, I did feel that, we should make this a permanent collaboration. And so we are actually living in the same house, married, and we're coming to you from the same screen today. Richard and I are both social epidemiologists. So epidemiologists are researchers who study the distribution and the determinants of different states of health and disease and well-being. And we're social epidemiologists, so we focus on the social determinants of health. And we wrote The Spirit Level because we felt we were sitting on a body of evidence, our own research and that of other people, that deserved to be better known by the public, by policymakers, and by politicians. And so we wrote the book to try and get that message across. And what The Spirit Level showed was that economic inequality, specifically income inequality, was what we were looking at, was related to a whole range of different problems, health problems, including physical and mental health, issues to do with human capital development, such as educational attainment and social mobility, and everything to do with human relationships, like social connectedness, trust, social capital. All of the research that we brought into that book had been peer-reviewed in academic journals previously, but I think people were really unaware of those connections. And we showed that the differences between different societies were very large. These were big effects, too big to be explained by what might be happening just among the poor. And I think that's the other crucial point, is that inequality seems to affect almost everybody in society. So those were the key messages of The Spirit Level. It was published in 2009. obviously into a context in which we just had the global financial crisis, although that unfolded, while we were writing. And it did have a large impact and a lot of reaction, probably because of that context and because it was new to so many people. A lot of that reaction was positive. Some of it was not. And if we had had a small amount of money, like £1 for every time somebody said to us that correlations don't prove causation, we would be able to join the top 1% and we wouldn't have to keep on writing books for a living. Of course, correlations don't prove causation, but sometimes that is exactly what they are showing. So what I want to focus on for the next few minutes is just what we have been doing with our time sort of since the Spirit Level was published. One of those things is to concentrate on examining the causal case for the inequality impact on health and society. We have examined that within an epidemiological causal framework. That's exactly the same framework that researchers use to show that smoking causes lung cancer. And we published those findings in 2015. And we're really sure now that income inequality is a cause of health and social problems, not the only one, of course, but a root cause that does need to be addressed. The other thing that's been happening is a massive expansion of research on inequality. It was almost as if we'd lit a touch flame. There's been a huge amount of research linking inequality to new outcomes such as domestic violence, to sleep, to schizophrenia and psychotic symptoms, to narcissism, self-enhancement, problem gambling, civic and cultural participation, child maltreatment, the list goes on. Just today, this morning, I was sent a new paper looking at mortality in regions of Canada, and Richard was sent a paper looking at depression in China. So the evidence base grows and grows, and it grows more and more robust. And I think the other key thing we've been doing is thinking about how inequality links into environmental issues, links into the biggest challenge facing us, really. And we could talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A if you want to, and Richard will touch on it briefly. And then we've been thinking a lot about the causal pathways. What are the pathways? How is it that income inequality is linked to all these things? And that's what Richard will touch on. So before I hand over to him, I'll just say what we think the impact has been. It's been different at different levels. We've seen quite a lot of impact and change in the discourse at the level of international bodies such as the World Bank, the United Nations bodies. Inequality is now a target within the Sustainable Development Goals, World Economic Forum, etc. And quite a lot of action and interest at the level of local and regional authorities within the UK and the devolved governments. But we have not seen progress at national level, which is all to do with the government we currently have. So I'm going to hand over to Richard now to talk about those causal pathways, and end by just saying we did also set up a charity to campaign and promote inequality or greater equality in the UK. And this week is the big give, where if you want to support that campaign, you can double your donation, and I will put the link for that in the chat later. But over to Richard now.
Thank you. I came into epidemiology after a first degree at LSE in economic history, but I also did courses with Popper, the philosopher of science, from whom I gained an enormous amount. And of course, the focus was on how you test theories and what the difference is between a good and a bad, a successful and a failing research program. The theory that inequality drives so many of these things has been tested over and over again, simply hundreds of times, as Kate said. But the other thing that Popper emphasized, of course, was novel predictions. And if these relationships we've shown are causal, then there have to be mechanisms driving them. And it's that I want to concentrate on, because a causal theory, in a way, a causal relationship is a theory that there are causal mechanisms. And so I'm going to cover a few of the outcomes and show the causal relationships. But people needn't be surprised as they are, that inequality has this importance, because actually it's only telling us a little bit more about that we always knew about class. Everyone knows that a whole range of problems are worse in the poorest areas of our cities. In a way, I think what we're talking about is whether we live in societies with very steep social class pyramids like that, or much shallower ones. That one, yes. All the problems we've concentrated on have these social gradients. They are all problems that are worse in the poorest areas of our societies. And so in a way, the only thing you have to do to understand this is to realize that we're talking about not absolute income, but relative income, where you are in relation to other people in society. That's what is driving these things. And I'll start just with talking about some of the causal mechanisms in terms of health. In epidemiology, people researching health inequalities, we were rather slow, I think, to recognize that social position itself, not just the differences in living and working conditions or diet, drove some of the really important differences in death rates. It was only when we became aware of primatologists, I think actually Sapolsky calls himself a neuroendocrinologist, he's at Stanford, and Carol Shively there is pointing out the difference in the arteries of high and low status animals. The very third up one she's pointing to is a low status macaque. On the left is the high status, clear arteries. And she was able to keep her animals in the same compounds, give them the same food, manipulate social status by moving them between troops.
Richard, just to say, Richard, we're not seeing the slides move on from our side, just in case that's important to the story.
You haven't. Just try clicking on that.
You keep talking and I'll keep working on that.
So we were very much helped by experimental work on primatologists, which came out with the same sort of correlations, many factors, physiological factors, stress hormones and so on, that we were seeing in human populations related to social status. And I do think we're dealing partly with the evolved sensitivity to social status differences. Can you...
You keep talking and I'll keep.
The next slide, I hope you'll see, shows the relationship between chronic stress and mortality rates. This is an extraordinarily sound study, 10 prospective cohort studies, and it's a pooled analysis of prospective cohort studies, so absolutely sound data. Then on the next slide, you can see blood clotting factors in men and women in Whitehall civil servants, which look just like the animals in relation to social status. And of course, if you're a subordinate monkey, you're going to get bitten often. You want your blood to clot fast. And so humans have that same pattern as if they're going to get bitten by superiors. As soon as we realized that stress was so important, of course, the first question we ask is, what are the most important causes of stress in the population? And our first thoughts, of course, were losing your home or your job or whatever. But when you look at the population as a whole, you get a rather different answer, because fortunately, losing your home isn't very common. But if you're looking at the public health of the whole population, experiments, hundreds, literally hundreds of published experiments looking at what raises people's stress levels, is that it's tasks which include what they call social evaluative threat. That's worries about how you're seen and judged by other people. Threats to self-esteem or social status, where your performance can be judged negatively. Those are the kind of issues that get to us biologically most strongly. Next. This shows, again, something we were quite unaware of when we were writing The Spirit Level. It's a paper that's come out long since, showing the different levels of status anxiety across the whole income scale, from the poorest tenth of the population to the richest tenth on the right. And in more unequal countries, that top line, you see the higher levels of status anxiety. So in more unequal societies with the bigger income differences, everyone becomes more worried about how they're seen and judged. And that actually is about our belief that the tendency to believe that some people are more important than others, and to start worrying more about how you're seen and judged. Now a few words about consumerism. There have been a number of studies internationally and amongst the American states showing if you live in a more unequal area, one of the things you do to try and improve how others see and judge you is you consume market goods. And so you spend more money on cars or on clothes with designer labels and so on. Yeah, then on mental health, there were some indications that mental health was worse in more unequal countries. And then Sherry Johnson published this paper where she looked at a huge range of papers on different mental illnesses, personality disorders, looking for self-reports, biological evidence, and observational evidence. She wanted all three together, and finding that actually these conditions were triggered or exacerbated by exposure to hierarchy through the social dominance behavioral system in our brain for dealing with those issues. Yeah. And now recently in the British Medical Journal Open, this paper came out showing the correlations along the bottom there, the correlation coefficients between the mental illnesses and personality disorders on the left and income inequality in the 36 OECD countries. So we do have important ideas about what the causal processes are. And lastly, violence. These are homicide rates in the American states and Canadian provinces. And you see they go from about 15 homicides per million people up to 150. And that is really driven by, as James Gilligan, the director for the Center of Study for Violence at Harvard, said, by people feeling disrespected, looked down on, humiliated. That's what triggers the violence that drives this relationship between inequality and homicide rates. And it's been shown probably 60 or more times in peer-reviewed papers. There's no doubt about so many of these relationships, that they are all simply a matter of relative income rather than absolute. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate and Richard. That was a brilliant run through and moving us on. I'm trying to think back to my review whether I said correlation does not mean causality. I probably did, but not in a way that would have dismissed all the brilliant evidence that you've got there. And it's great to hear more about the mechanisms from you both on that causal path. So before just hand over to David, just remind people Q&A is open. There's lots of great questions going in. Do have a look at those, upvote them, or add your own. Thank you. David.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for inviting me to do this. And I take part in some kind of trepidation because I'm absolutely not an expert in this. I'm not an epidemiologist of any kind, and actually spent about a year trying to say the word epidemiologist. So I'm flattered to be asked to take part in this. Particularly flattered because actually when I did write about the spirit level back in 2009, I most certainly did talk about causation and correlation. Therefore, must have been one of the irritating people that Kate was talking about, particularly since she knew far more about it than I did. And there I was talking about the methodology. But anyway, thank you for having me. And one of the things that I think I have learned more in the last few years as I've become, if you like, a veteran, is to see the value of something without actually the need to agree with every aspect of it. And this is increasingly important in, if you like, in the kind of contentious world of epidemiology and social epidemiology, as it is in other areas, because you can dispute aspects of the work that people do in complex areas, but you have to try to understand that they might actually have an intense value anyway. Now, this I can see can be irritating to the authors of work sometimes because they will want to insist upon the accuracy of every aspect of what they do. But for those of us who observe, we don't actually necessarily require that. So the one thing that first thing I'd like to say about the spirit level was that it really was an incredibly important intervention in raising the discussion about what equality and inequality actually are. In other words, getting us to debate what we mean by these things and what they could consist of and what they might do to societies and how we might go about the business of trying to discover that. The other thing that I want to say about the original book was that what was also very important about it that I don't think I quite understood at the time was how important it was to be international in scope. In other words, an awful lot of our discussions here in Britain, as I imagine they are in other countries, are incredibly parochial. And they're so parochial, actually, that you might actually think that the entire debate about equality and inequality in Britain is sometimes reduced simply down to the question of who gets into Oxbridge, and has been for a very long time. And one of the things that the spirit level did was to take you entirely out of that world. Now, at the time, back in 2009, I had my worries about the absolute nature of the thesis, what I kind of thought of as kind of Gini coefficient determinism, and so on, because, for the very simple question, which again must have irritated the authors a lot, such as, do you smoke because someone who used to earn £1 more than you now earns £2 more than you? And I had difficulty, and sometimes I still do, thinking about the causal effect there, which is, as you just heard, usually explained in terms of the way in which income and social status interact. By the way, I would quite like, in the discussion that is to come, us to look a bit about what's happened since 2009, because it does seem to me that I would like to know what it is that the authors have learned, particularly during the period of the pandemic. 2009 was a moment of hiatus here between the crash and the end of the Labour government. We've since then had 14 years of a Conservative government with a particular set of policies, and I'd like to hear a bit about that. I'd also like to hear what the authors think about the problem that we now perceive of how low status and high status are now increasingly detached from income. We talked about losing your home being rare, but actually one of the things you hear very often now is how owning your own home is becoming increasingly difficult. And for those of us who have young adults in our families and so on, or who listen a lot to them, it is very hard to escape the idea that there is an increased level of stress related to the fact that your status no longer determines necessarily income. By the way, can I also just say that I enjoyed enormously the fact that no one mentioned how all our problems are really just down to social media, which is actually the other great trope, modern trope that we have. But I'm sure that you could reflect upon how social media reflects notions of inequality and status, because I think that would be useful as well. The final point I'd like to make at this point is that I kind of also perceive something else about the damage that a certain kind of inequality does to society, but it won't be found in these correlations. The first, of course, is the damage that absolute poverty or even relative poverty causes, which you can, in terms of genuine anxiety about whether or not you will be able to make ends meet. But then the other one is in terms of the massive amounts of power wielded by an incredibly small number of people in society, as we move into the Qatari, Saudi, oligarch, Elon Musk era, where massive power is wielded by vastly rich but very few people, and what effect that has on the rest of us. So those are just some of the things that I would enjoy to find addressed in the discussion coming up. And thank you again for inviting me.
Oh, thanks, David. That was great. And we will come back to Kate and Richard on some of those points. Just as an aside, we did some survey research with Fairness Foundation and the APPG on inclusive growth, which looked at that question of who has power and influence in society. And when the question was asked in 2018, it was the government that came top. When we asked it in 2022, it was the very wealthy who came top by some distance. So people, even in that short 5-year period, people have seen that shift to that power at the very top of those elites being a big issue for society. So straight over to Lucinda, I think, next.
Thanks very much. I'm going to bring in some reflections from my involvement with the IFS Deaton Review of Inequality, and this focuses primarily on the UK. And I'm also going to bring in some observations drawing on my own research on inequality, and that has investigated primarily inequalities between groups rather than across societies as a whole. And again, it's focused primarily on the UK. So sorry, David, I'm not bringing an international approach here. But I hope the connections with the spirit level and spirit level thesis will become clear as I speak. In my own research, more specifically, I've looked at how labour market opportunities are unequally distributed across ethnic groups, how immigrants do or do not manage to capitalise on their skills, how women are concentrated in particular occupations, and how that and periods out of paid work affects their pay, and how disabled and children and disabled adults face obstacles in education and work. These issues of intergroup inequality are extensively covered in the IFS Deaton Review of Inequality, both through core chapters on gender, immigration, race and ethnicity and health, and through commentaries bringing different perspectives to these topics. In addition, conceptualizations of inequality, public attitudes are also topics that are scrutinized in detail in the review, as well as politics, child development, family structure, education, health, geography, and the ways inequalities are shaped by labour markets, firms, trade, and globalization. The history of inequality is addressed, trends in inequality in income and wealth are mapped and scrutinized, and the top of the distribution and taxation are considered alongside the extent to which low incomes are protected by benefits and how they are protected. So I'd recommend you to look up this extremely rich and comprehensive body of research, which is all available on the IFS Deaton Review website. So amidst this rich array of topics, I'm going to focus in the very short time available to me on between group inequalities. I think they raise particular considerations for how we understand and respond to inequality. But this also involves first thinking about how inequality is being conceptualized and theorized, why it matters, how it matters, and who it matters to. A core distinction, which has often commanded some degree of consensus, is that equality of opportunity is central. Your life chances should not be affected by who you are, the circumstances you were born into, or ascribed characteristics such as sex or ethnicity. But that attempts to ensure equality of outcomes are more difficult to justify, given that people vary in their abilities, skills, and effort, and that these differences should deserve some recognition. This is a widely held view. It's in many ways intuitive, and it's often maintained in people's take on inequality. And this has been found in Bobby Duffy's own work for the Deaton Review on public attitudes to inequality. Public opinion largely endorses the view that unequal rewards should attend to differences in talent and effort, and that some inequality is therefore justified, raising then the question of how much. People have an attachment to fairness, but fairness encompasses a range of ideas and not necessarily objections to inequality per se. Additional research on attitudes finds that people are more willing to accept inequalities that reflect performance rather than inequalities that reflect luck. But of course, what is luck and what is performance is a very moot question. And writers such as Robert Frank, for example, have addressed how the role of luck in success is often underplayed. How much people worry about inequality depends on their perceptions of its causes, and the perceptions of its causes are also shaped by how well off they are. So even if inequality is bad for everyone in the way set out by Wilkinson and Pickett, persuading those who think they have rightfully benefited from it may be challenging. And I think that's something we need to pay attention to, how people do think about that. But from a conceptual and philosophical perspective, the distinction between inequality of opportunity and inequality of outcome is in fact harder to maintain. Intergenerational processes mean that inequalities of outcome in one generation, even if achieved through a combination of equal opportunities and differential talents, make it hard to guarantee equality of opportunity in the next, as parents attempt to do their best for their own children. And it's typically regarded as reasonable that parents should try to do the best for their children. And it's also not always possible to ascertain where the dividing line is between talent that is innate and that which is shaped by environment. Research has also demonstrated that what we consider to be effort is itself also socially patterned, indicating that there's a relevance of environment also for effort. So that leaves unresolved the question of what a level playing field would in fact look like, and who decides when we've got a level playing field. Studying disability and migration, as I do, brings into sharp relief questions of equality of opportunity. Disability can bring in highly relevant issues of adjustments that may need to be made to ensure opportunities and ensure that individuals can fulfill their potential. The area of disability is perhaps one of the clearest examples of the need for a level playing field. It can emphasize the importance of meaningful opportunities and ways that these may be routinely ignored or neglected, and also the ways that possibilities can be offered. And that may be informative for how we think about policy more widely, how we think about policy that does ensure that we don't ignore and neglect opportunities. But at the same time, approaches that focus on compensation for circumstances or challenges or perceived deficits in making adjustments may lose sight of other facets of value about who and what people are over and above their educational or labour market potential. Such compensation or approach that takes a deficit approach may not do justice to the essential conditions of dignity, self-respect and autonomy that are of importance to all, regardless of their specific talents. And we can see this going back to Adam Smith's discussion of the importance of the avoidance of shame, as well as in some of the material Richard Wilkinson was just showing. From my own research, I know that children with special educational needs will only go on to university in very small proportions. So it's not only important that for those for whom it could be an option, that they're provided the opportunity to do so. The Oxbridge point made by David Aaronovitch, but also that there are meaningful opportunities for those who do not go and will not be able to go. And as noted in the education chapter for the Deaton Review, the focus on university education and opportunities for university education has come at the expense often of meaningful post-16 and post-18 pathways for those for whom university is not the right option. There isn't only one route that we need to equalise. So a focus on equality of opportunity for the most able educationally should not consign those who are less educationally proficient to a limited set of options and poorer life chances. Turning very briefly to migration, I'm going to stop shortly. A lot of our focus in studying migration is on how well immigrants fare compared to non-migrants in their countries of destination. This is the inequality that migration scholars such as myself typically investigate, as well as questions such as those covered in the Deaton Review chapter of how much immigration contributes to inequality, answer being not much. But there is a form of inequality that's perhaps more fundamental, the way that life chances are shaped to a large extent by one's country of origin. The large inequalities, even if there are large inequalities within countries, the birthright lottery, as Drechsler calls it, and the different possibilities offered by your citizenship of birth is critical in the extent to which you can achieve rewards for your talent and effort. The inequalities faced by immigrants in countries of destination are the ones we see, but the inequalities faced by non-migrants in different countries are perhaps the more important ones, the global inequalities that we may need to engage with more, and that are more harder, I think, for the public, for ourselves to engage with meaningfully. Levels of inequality are often naturalized at the national level. That's the unit we're most familiar to dealing with, and one where policy is formed. And it's also thought of as being reasonable because it's a community to which we can relate. Global inequalities seem rather remote, and maybe not ones we can realistically consider as fair or not in such a coherent way. But research and responses to and on views about inequality suggest that people's points of view are actually much more local. They look to the locality, neighbourhood, social network, or employment context for their immediate reference points. They're not looking to the national, and yet they can be concerned about inequalities between geographies. And it's inequalities between places that are the ones that in fact most concern people in the UK, as the evidence from looking at attitudes for inequality showed. And this shows that people can be concerned beyond their reference points. If their reference points are local, but they worry about inequality between places, they can think beyond those reference points. And I think that's something that we maybe need to think more about and can think about what the implications are. The research brings into sharp relief the conundrums raised by within and between area inequalities. How, in spirit level terms, the greater inequalities in areas, how far the greater inequalities in areas like London are worse for people than the smaller inequalities in less affluent areas. Are these what we should be concerned about, or is it the inequalities between areas that, as people tend to think, are in fact the most invidious? And I should leave it there because I think I've gone over my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lucinda. Great stuff. Paul, over to you.
Look, good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here, and may I just say so far that I have to acknowledge and agree with the great work of Kate and Richard. It's easy for me to understand, having spent 6 years as chair of Teach First, involved with some of the most disadvantaged communities in the UK, where I think you see firsthand the enormous challenge that wealth inequality can bring. We already know in this country that there's a direct correlation between education outcomes and the postcode from where people come from. So I buy the research. I guess the second comment I would make before I just say a few words about business is I'm not sure that everybody across the nation would understand and agree on the nature and extent of inequality in the country. For those of us who look at it, it becomes very obvious, but it's not necessarily well understood either in terms of the extent and scale of inequality or indeed its impact, I would suggest. But coming from a business point of view, why I'm here today, I start on the basis that business is a force for good, that business is part of society, not apart from society, and therefore what goes on in a nation or society is important. And the issue of fairness and equality, to my mind, is a fundamental value that can shape the culture of a nation and the culture of an organization or the culture of a business. So the issue of inequality, I think, is incredibly pervasive. But if I was to sort of say, let me make the case, the business case for equality, I would say there are 6 good reasons why businesses would have it on the agenda. The first is centered very much on economic and social stability. There's no doubt that the greater the inequality, the greater the risk of social instability is, never mind the impact on economic inequality. The second good business reason is the more uniform or the more spread wealth is, the greater the wealth distribution, the more opportunity is for consumers to spend. And frankly, the more consumers spend, the more the economy grows and everybody benefits. I think a third very compelling reason is that the lifeblood of business is innovation and creativity, and that comes from getting the very best in terms of diversity and inclusion. And when I think about diversity, I don't think gender, I don't think race, I think about diversity in all its dimensions, not least of which important is people who come from poor backgrounds relative to the rest of society, and younger people as well as older people. A fourth and a theme touched on by several speakers is, business thrives on employee engagement, employee motivation, and talent retention. And people are motivated, they're engaged, they're retained when they believe the company is being run well, when it operates in a fair and equal way. And when they don't see that, they're disenchanted, dissatisfied, and very often vote with their feet. So there's a very good business case reason there. Fifth would be, I guess, one of the most compelling reasons of all, that it takes a lifetime to build a reputation or build a brand, but that can be lost in minutes. And the fastest way for companies to lose the reputation today is when society or consumers decide that their values, their beliefs, or their behaviors aren't the right ones. And therefore, I think inequality sits in that zone as well. And finally, if you're not persuaded by all the positive reasons about why this matters for business, there is the ultimate determinant, and that is, it is society that gives us our license to operate in business. It is consumers who decide whether or not they will spend their money on our goods and services. And if we fail those 2 gates, ultimately there's regulation or the law to deal with us. So I hope I've given a sense that this agenda is not separate from the world of business. It's at the core of what business is and should be about. And I'm delighted to be with you this afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paul. Incredibly important points. And yeah, really important to raise public understanding. That's why an appreciation of this as an issue, that's where we spend so much of our time on public attitudes work. And it does come up against this barrier of misunderstandings, but also low salience for people. It's important when you prompt people. It's not top of mind when you're thinking about how votes are determined or other aspects, interestingly. Great. Well, I'm going to come back to Richard and Kate to reflect on any of the thoughts from those, but given that we're short of time, I'm also going to cheekily try to run in some questions, because some of the themes that panelists brought up really do reflect the questions that we saw. And I've got 3 groups of questions. I'm going to try and get through all the 3. The first is about change. Second is whether it's really as bad as it makes out. And then the third is about the future. So the first group, which really reflects some of the things David was saying, is really about your understanding of change since, Kate and Richard. So has the pandemic, which brought into focus the effects of inequalities in health and opportunity, has that changed our understanding and ability to address the social determinants of health? But then there's also a theme within the questions, the popular questions, about whether things really have changed quite so much. So the question asking the headline measure of UK inequality, the Gini coefficient, has not increased since the time of the book, despite the political and economic change and the perception that society has become more unequal. Are you surprised? Do you think inequality has got worse by other measures? Is it a sign of success that inequality hasn't risen, or failure that it's so high and hasn't reduced? So I guess grouping that together with David's point is, what do you think has changed and what hasn't since then? And what have we learned and not learned?
Well, in a way, I mean, we publish a book like that hoping that it will have policy and political impact, and that things will change. I do think we've seen a change in public political policymakers' understanding. I do think inequality is, on the agenda and issue. I do think more people are sort of aware of its impact. But we did see when the pandemic hit that, there was great surprise at which sectors of society were most affected by COVID-19, which wasn't, of course, a surprise to social epidemiologists, but clearly this idea about who is most vulnerable to the impacts of relative poverty and who is most vulnerable to precarity hadn't really got through. Inequality, yeah, it's not that much different in the UK now to what it was when we wrote the book, but it's really important to remember that the big rise in inequality in the UK took place in the early 1980s, and no government since then has managed to sort of unpack that and address that systematically. So we are still living with extreme levels of inequality, and in comparison to other countries, even if there hasn't actually been much shift. Perhaps it would all have got a lot worse without that understanding that inequality is a bad thing. We don't know. But what we've certainly learned in the past 14 years is how devastating austerity is, and how devastating it is for so many people to be destitute, precarious, unable, as David said, to even think about getting on the housing ladder. And I do think we have a better understanding, as Lucinda was talking about the different ways in which what we think of as vertical inequalities of income, power, voice, wealth intersect with inequalities related to where you lived, to geography, and to the kind of groups that you belong to. Yeah, I'll stop there. Do you want to do your next one? Because
I think that the effects of inequality take a long time to come through, and I don't think anyone doubts that we are a more antisocial society than we were before the rises of inequality, particularly in the 1980s. But just as we saw as Japanese equality improved from the war to about sometime in the 1980s, and its health advanced, its crime decreased in the long term, I think we're seeing a gradual slide of our health performance, just as the United States is. Kate often shows a slide showing league tables of infant mortality, and each year that passes, we come lower in that international league table of infant mortality, doing worse and worse. The United States life expectancy shows just the same pattern. And of course, there are about 8 papers now showing that different aspects of the pandemic were worse in more unequal societies. I think the deaths of despair, there's a paper out of the Harvard School of Public Health showing that coupled with low social mobility that always seems to accompany big inequalities, that the two together have contributed to those so-called rising death rates, deaths of despair, alcohol, drugs, suicide, and so on. And of course, we've seen some of the same sort of processes in Britain, the two countries in the developed world where inequality has increased most rapidly. On the opportunity of outcome and opportunity of equal opportunities for children that Lucinda discussed, I think it's really important to emphasize the point she made, that you really can't have equality of opportunity for children with big inequalities of outcome. And the close correlations between intergenerational social mobility and inequality really point that out.
Great stuff. So let's just come to the panel. Any other reflections on that group of questions? Lucinda.
I was just going to say on the inequality hasn't changed, has it? Well, that is a bit of an issue of measurement. If you look at, for example, Stephen Jenkins's commentary on for the Deaton Review, he shows how on a Gini measurement, which doesn't take very good account of top incomes, it looks like there's been stability. But if you take proper account of top incomes, that's where the growth has been, and that those earning sort of quite high earnings and those earning very top earnings, that gap has increased substantially. So on some takes, yes, inequality has actually increased. And then the second point is that I think inequality can be understood differently depending what's happening with the economy more generally. So when we've had stagnation in wages, austerity, sensitivity to inequality is likely to be different from how it's perceived when there's a time of growth and rising wages. And I think the fact that we've seen stagnation in wages is I mean, it's kind of unprecedented, and therefore makes people much more sensitized and changes the context.
Good. David or Paul, anything to add? David, you're on mute if you're.
I'd just like to repeat my question rather than answer it, which is, since the Spirit Level in 2009, we have seen effectively the rise of social media, which has transformed the way in which society interrelates. And if one of the issues, the significant issues, is, as is suggested, status anxiety, and given that social media will be the primary way in which people measure their status against others, I'd just like to hear your reflections, the reflections of Richard and Kate about that.
Great point.
Sure, thank you. I mean, social media, of course, is for some people an absolute salvation and a source of their best social relationships and an alleviation of their anxieties. I have a deaf niece for whom it's, you know, primary means of communication and the way in which she is able to have social relationships. For others, it's a source of bullying and a source of distress. So I don't think it's clear cut. I was looking at the evidence just the other day, actually, on social media in relation to adolescent mental well-being, and the studies are very mixed. And I think because of this nuanced picture that for some social media is a good thing and for others less so. Time spent on social media is certainly related to more anxieties about social status. So I do think we are starting to see clear evidence of that. Sorry, Richard, did you want to come in?
Yeah, there are big inequalities, big differences internationally in bullying in schools. There are several studies using different data. We produced one in the Spirit Level, actually. And where you've got bullying, there are very big differences in the amount of bullying between one country and another. Where you've got a lot of bullying, kids will use social media to do that bullying. So I think the important thing to recognize is that social media are often the messenger and will be used differently in different kinds of societies.
Great. Thank you. So I'm going to have a final group of questions, just two together, and I'm going to go around the panel and then end with Kate and Richard. And it is about the future, a sense of what's changed and what's blocked change, and then what does that mean for the future. So the two questions which were submitted in advance actually are, what do you think are the real blockers to progress in tackling the issues you identified so clearly so many years ago? And do you have any optimism left about the chances of seeing changes that the book showed that we need? So two questions. I'm going to come to our panelists first. David, do it in order. You've got like 30 seconds each on these little questions, small questions of... Oh, you're muted, David.
I honestly don't want to take up any more time at this point. I actually don't feel qualified to answer those questions, Bobby, which is not just a kind of cop-out, but it's a kind of recognition of my real role in this discussion.
Very good. Very, very honest. Thank you. David, Lucinda, what have the blockers been, and do you have any optimism for the future?
I have some optimism, because I think to the extent that people do care about fairness and finding some way of translating that, so we don't think in a way that seems a bit remote about inequality, but we think about the relations between people. And there has been there has been improvement on some dimensions. There have been some success stories. We're very good at showing the problem stories, but there has been a lot of improvement over time in some dimensions and some between group inequalities. So I think we should think about what those have taught us and how we may capitalize on those.
Thank you, Lucinda. Paul.
Look, great question. Two thoughts. The first is I'm very clear that the blockers are by and large the leadership in various positions, politically and otherwise in society. And the reason to be hugely optimistic is I think the next generation, the younger leaders, the younger people in our society have totally different sets of values, beliefs, behaviors. And I'm immensely confident about the long term. The only question is, how do we get there?
Brilliant. Thank you, Paul. And Kate and Richard, final words on those.
Well, I won't say anything about the blockers. I think there are many of them. Obviously, status competition driving consumerism upwards is a huge obstacle to moving towards sustainability. I go as far as saying we cannot solve the environmental crisis without solving the inequality crisis. The reports from the UN and from Oxfam and so on just recently show the enormous differences in carbon footprints between rich and poor, both within countries and internationally. We just have to tackle inequality in order to deal with the environmental crisis.
Thank you. Kate.
I'll just finish by saying I agree with Paul, actually. It is young people that give me hope and optimism and the values that they hold. We have grandchildren and we can see, them growing up in a world where they are not expecting that the environmental crisis can be solved by government as usual, and they are not expecting that things can stay the same. So young people give us hope. And in terms of blockers, it's ideology all the way. But that's why it's important that we keep writing books, we keep publishing papers, we keep talking to people, we keep coming to panel discussions like this, and why we do all try and keep this issue alive.
Brilliant. What a great way to end with a bit of optimism. So we do need to stop there. Brilliant discussion. Slightly ironically, my last task was to point you to our next one, which is not such an optimistic take. It's Peter Turchin's book, End Times, which is painting a rather less optimistic view of the future. But that is on the 12th of December, I think, at lunchtime as well. So Peter Turchin's book, End Times, for a less optimistic take on where we go next on this. So finally, from me, just to thank everyone for coming and staying with us today, to the teams at the Policy Institute and Will Snell at the Fairness Foundation for this great series, to our brilliant panel, and of course to Kate and Richard for a truly brilliant book. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.